good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. Let's go ahead and get started. We may have a few more participants trickle in, but in the interest of time, I'd like to get started on today's session. And first introduce myself. My name is Tom Spangler, and I'm the Chief of Party for Research and Learning for Livelihood Security and Resilience at Save the Children. And before we get into the meat of today's session, I'm going to review a few technical instructions for this morning's session with you. First, please remain on mute when you're not speaking. And if you'd like to view a live transcript of the presentations, you can click the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says CC. Also note that we are recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing the recording in the next few days. If you need any tech support during the meeting, please reach out to Karina in the chat box. And lastly, so that we can efficiently use time for feedback and questions from the audience, we encourage each of you to use the link to the Google Doc Karina will share in the chat to submit comments and questions. When doing that, if you see a question you also have, you can type a plus symbol to upvote it, and we'll try to prioritize those common questions for response from our panelists. Now, on to the reason we've invited you all here today. As you know, this webinar has been organized through the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning, or REAL Award. And REAL is a consortium-led effort funded by the USAID Center for Resilience and implemented by Save the Children, Mercy Corps, and Tango International. It's intended to respond to continued demand among a wide range of stakeholders for rigorous and practical support for resilience analysis, monitoring, and learning. And since its inception in 2016, REAL has conducted extensive resilience research in the form of impact evaluations, recurrent monitoring surveys, and case studies, resulting in publication of dozens of detailed research reports and learning products, rich with both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Still, nearing the end of the REAL Award, we were challenged to synthesize all we had learned in a format that would be accessible and practically useful for a wide range of practitioners. And so in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, we're forced to acknowledge that some of maybe a virtual approach to synthesizing our learning would be more appropriate and more useful than an in-person culmination event, which we had initially planned. And similarly, after considering, say, development of a series of infographics to convey some of this learning and key topics, REAL partners and the Institute for Development Impact agreed that an interactive dashboard would be a much better resource for allowing users to draw your own conclusions from the evidence we've collected and take a deeper look at the technical guidance and analysis that supports it. So over the last year, combined efforts have resulted in this resource that we're really excited to share with you and get your feedback on today. In terms of objectives for today, by the end of the webinar, we hope each of the participants will come away with a better understanding of the types of data collected to measure the impact and performance of USAID resilience investments in shock-prone regions. We also hope that you'll learn how to use the dashboard to access more detailed resilience research conducted in specific contexts. And finally, we hope that you'll gain a one-stop access to research and methodological guidance that can support your own efforts to better understand and measure resilience and resilience capacities. So with those objectives in mind, let's get the conversation started. I'm honored to introduce our speakers and panelists today. They include Christine Gottschalk, Director for the Center for Resilience in the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Greg Collins, formerly with USAID and currently Associate Vice President for Resilience and International Development Research for the Arizona Institutes for Resilience at the University of Arizona. Tim Frankenberger, who's the President of Tango International. Micah Frumpkin, Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, Research and Learning at the Institute for Development Impact. And Emily Marshall, Resilience Learning Advisor here at Save the Children. I'll now pass it over to Christine to offer a few opening remarks. Christine.
Hi, thanks, Tom. It's really exciting to be launching this dashboard with all of you today. At at its core, our resilience work really is about equipping communities and countries to manage and adapt to shocks and stresses, both those that we have today and thinking about tomorrow's challenges. Um, Yet so much of our development and humanitarian work and what we all do as practitioners is driven by sector-specific approaches and programming. Yet we know that working across sectors, across systems, increases household resilience, which is not just to singular shocks, but to the compounding nature of shocks and stresses. And it also really improves sector-specific outcomes. We're 10 years into our resilience efforts, and we're feeling very acutely right now the compound impacts of climate change, of COVID-19, and of conflict. And the frequency and the intensity of shocks and stresses, both at the local level, as well as those that impact regions or multiple regions at once, is increasing. This really is a critical juncture. And this tool, the body of evidence that we have, this foundational set of evidence, aggregated across countries, looking across projects, is really important. And it is really important that this data is accessible to a wide variety of audiences, and that we're also thinking about local communities and local partners in accessing and using data too. So having a user-centered platform is really important, and this really provides a much needed foundational evidence base for us to build on. It needs to be used to inform not just our current programming, but really thinking about future policy, future investments, and decision making. The challenges to both those we're addressing today, as well as we look ahead, are really sobering. But it's also important to keep in mind just how much we've learned over the past decade. I was just in the Horn of Africa, and while the region is in the midst of a deep and really devastating drought, the region was not without hope. In northern Kenya, markets are functioning. Livestock deaths and the effect on Kenya's GDP are down by comparison to the droughts of 2011 and 2017. In Somalia, there is some really interesting approaches, some working with the private sector and fortifying foods. And after several successive failed rains, locusts, some households who have been supported with drought-tolerant varieties, climate-smart practices, after locusts, they were able to sell not just in their local markets, but also to the humanitarian market and to humanitarian organizations to meet their needs. There's so much to do. I don't want to underestimate the impact, but there is a tremendous amount that we can build on. We are going to need to change, adapt, and innovate to meet the challenges ahead. The evidence base, user-centered platforms like this, they will help inform where we need to go to achieve our goal of equipping communities and countries to manage and adapt to shocks and stresses, both to address today's and tomorrow's challenges. So with that, I'm going to pass back over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for those opening remarks. I'll now pass it to my colleague, Emily Marshall, who will walk us through a brief overview of the dashboard itself. Emily.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Christine, for your opening remarks. As Tom said, my name is Emily Marshall, and I am a research and learning advisor on the REAL Award, and I worked closely with our colleagues at the Institute for Development Impact over the past year on this dashboard project. So I'm just going to take a few minutes now to walk you through the dashboard to show you how to navigate it. So this is the main page of the dashboard here. There are 3 tabs at the top: Home, About the Dashboard, and Contact. Under About the Dashboard, you can view more information about the REAL Award, and this dashboard project, as well as view an instructional video. Under the Contact tab, you can email the REAL team here or view more information about REAL team members. Click the Home tab to return to the main dashboard. On the left side of the screen down here, you'll see the table of contents. Click those 3 orange bars to open the table of contents. You can click any section to jump directly to it. This first section focuses on the program sources of resilience evidence used in the dashboard. For instance, we have included multiple surveys and evaluations of the PRIME project in Ethiopia in this dashboard. So click the small arrow next to any of these program titles to view more information about that program, view sources from which the data was drawn for the dashboard, as well as which quantitative data was used in the dashboard here. So for instance, for Ethiopia, for PRIME, we used all baseline and endline survey data for the quantitative indicators included. The next section is a large interactive map displaying the quantitative indicators collected by the REAL Award. Above the map, you'll see 4 different categories: shocks and stresses, resilience, capacity, coping strategies, and food security. So you can click on any of these to view indicators within that category. I'll click resilience capacity for now. On the left side of the map, you'll view several indicators in that category. Clicking on any of these will open a white text box in the top left, and that will provide more information on the indicator itself, as well as references to learn more about how this indicator is calculated. For in example, the index of asset ownership. On the right side of the map, you can also click to view the methodological guide for calculating resilience capacity. This will open a document created by the REAL Award that focuses on resilience and resilience capacity measurement, and we hope will be useful in your own work. You may also, in the map, click on any country directly to view all indicators for that country in a pop-up window. So first, you'll see the resilience capacity indicators here, but you can click See All Resilience Capacity Indicators to open a larger window that shows this data at 2 time points. So like we talked about earlier, the baseline and endline survey time points for the PRIME project in Ethiopia. Within this pop-up, you can also click Read More to view the data source. Click the X to close out and return to the map. And just remember that you can always scroll up to click a different category of indicators. This next section focuses on capacities that enable recovery and have a protective effect on households. This is shown in both a bubble chart and a tabular format. In the bubble chart, protective effective capacities by duration of effect, you can view these capacities by country and by duration, so initial, continuous, and long-term effects. To the right of the bubble chart, you will also see a list of the resilience capacity indices and their components, so the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity indices components. Scrolling up, you can click Protective Effective Capacities by Context to view this information in a tabular format. You'll see that some capacities have multiple duration effects. This next section is just a text-based section. It focuses on resilience capacities critical for effective coping. Simply click each tab to read more about that capacity and click relevant links to open the data sources from which these conclusions were drawn. This section focuses on other capacities by program in a Sankey diagram. So a Sankey diagram shows the linkages between these capacities and the program name. So you can hover over these rectangles to view the linkages. Click each rectangle to view more about that relevant capacity in this text box here. Or on the right, click the program name to read a bit more about the program. And again, you can click the source here to view the relevant report from which this information was drawn. To view all the information included in this diagram at once, you can click this small question mark icon to the right of the program title. Click that again to close it. The next few sections focus on humanitarian assistance and resilience. This is another text-based section, so you can click on each tab to view more about this key factor of humanitarian assistance, for instance, social connections and norms, and click the relevant sources listed below the text to read more in detail. This section describes humanitarian assistance provided to households by country in another map. This map is not actually interactive, but just lists some data from surveyed households that in real research. The data sources are also linked below the map, so you can click on any of these to view more. The next section is another Sankey diagram, but this time looking at humanitarian assistance by program. Again, click on the rectangles to read more about each section. And the final section summarizes key takeaways from this synthesis of resilience research in 3 main categories: what works in resilience programming, what to consider when designing resilience programming, and monitoring, evaluating, learning, and adaptive management for resilience programming. So under each tab, you'll see the list of key takeaways plus a description of each to the right. This is a little bit longer section, so I'll leave you to read that on your own. But that concludes the dashboard here. Just a reminder that you can open the table of contents at any time to jump to any section of interest. And that is the end of the dashboard. Thank you for your attention. I will hand it back to Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. That was really useful synopsis of what's in there. As you all can see, there is quite a lot of information, both presented in the dashboard and linked directly to it. So we encourage you all to spend some time there and get more familiar with it as a resource, because it's quite rich, and we again hope that it will be useful for you in a number of ways. But thanks for that overview, Emily. Also, based on Emily's description and the feedback from our panelists, we encourage each of you to enter your own questions or pose your own questions for them to respond to. You can do that either in the Google Doc sheet or in the chat box. So what we'll do now is just start the conversation with some of our panelists today and get their feedback on the utility of this as a resource. I'd like to first start with you, Greg. You obviously have a unique perspective on the history of this evidence generation around resilience for USAID. And I was wondering if you could offer your perspective on what motivated this resilience research over the last decade. And from your point of view, why is it important to continue that type of analysis going forward?
Sure, thanks, Tom. And I would double down on the encouragement to carve out some time in your day to really dive into this dashboard. It's an incredible resource and presented incredibly well. So congratulations to all the teams responsible for producing it. You know, Tom, when we started this work a decade ago, there were a lot of opinions about what made households and communities more resilient. If you talk to someone who worked on water security, they'd point to water security. If you talk to someone who worked in agriculture, they'd point to agriculture. Same for governance, health, and so on. And there was actually very little evidence about what actually made households and communities more resilient. People were imputing the impact of investments in these sectors on well-being outcomes as proof that they were building resilience. But actually, that's not what resilience is. Resilience is what happens to well-being outcomes in the face of shocks and stresses. So some leaps of faith were required. One leap of faith was the belief that strengthening resilience required working across and beyond sectors. And as Christine noted, there's now significant evidence presented in this dashboard to substantiate that leap of faith. It also enables us to take a much more refined approach when thinking about investment decision-making and project design than we did a decade ago. It's not untrue to say, in some sense, in the early days of building the portfolios in the Horn of Africa and Sahel, we're taking a kitchen sink approach. Now we have much more refined, evidence-based way to make those decisions. I'd also say, reflecting on Christine's remarks, that she's absolutely right. This is incredibly timely, and not just timely because it provides a foundation for the next generation of resilience evidence, project design, et cetera, but because of the accelerating climate crisis, because of the current crisis in the Horn of Africa, there's actually a lot of misunderstanding out there still regarding the state of resilience evidence. And that's in large part because it hasn't been easily accessible. You'd have to churn through a 300-page report at best, a PowerPoint about one specific project. So putting this evidence together in an aggregated way, in an interactive way, makes a major contribution to addressing that problem. And I think that's a huge accomplishment for USAID and the Center for Resilience and the teams that supported them in doing this. I also think it's really important in relation to what I would call a misinterpretation by some about what's happening in the Horn of Africa. I've heard people say, you know, is it really worth investing in resilience? Look at the Horn of Africa is once again on the brink of famine in some places. But you have to realize these projects, although designed to deal with recurrent crisis, were not designed to deal with the compound, complex state of affairs in the Horn of Africa right now, including, as we all know, the extraordinary impact of COVID-19 that still is present in the Horn of Africa. And then most recently, Russia's war in Ukraine, which has had an incredibly negative impact on food prices and fertilizer. And so the takeaway there isn't, should we invest in resilience? It's how do we double down on resilience, including using this evidence base to double down. And one key takeaway that Emily showed in that dashboard that I think is so germane to that, given the current state of affairs in the Horn of Africa, is the need to scale shock responsive safety nets. It doesn't matter whether you're in Kenya or California, there are always going to be shocks and stresses that overwhelm the capacities of households and communities to manage on their own. And so we need to continue investing in those capacities, but recognize that given the current state of affairs, the extreme and devastating example going on in the Horn right now, we need to be thinking bigger. How do we invest more systematically in the systems and institutions that support households, communities, and countries? So that's some initial reflections, Tom. Back to you.
Okay, very much appreciate that, Greg. Again, you've got a unique perspective on how all of this has evolved. And as we explained, we're trying to kind of give an overall picture or tell a story of from the analysis that we have done thus far. And your explanation gives a very strong case for how it's used, why it's important. So thank you very much for that. I will note that we have one question now in the Google Doc sheet, and it's one that we expected. Tia, thanks for offering it. And it is, will we be expanding the dashboard to other countries and timeframes? And by that, I take it to mean whether we will be adding new data, new analysis to that. And the answer is hopefully, yes. Obviously, we've got to work closely with our partners under REAL and our counterparts at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. But yes, we hope this can be a living resource for everyone. So encourage others to add questions in the Google Doc that they might have. Before that, or meanwhile, I'll turn to you, Tim. Much of the analysis that we have represented in the dashboard was generated by Tango. And I'll just note that there is, a long history here of Tango's involvement in resilience measurement, and many of the impact evaluations and other research reports were developed for specific audiences and for specific purposes for key decision makers with their own set of analysis needs. So I was wondering if you could tell us just a bit about how resilience measurement has evolved, including under REAL, and how that's enabled us as a community of practitioners to arrive at some standard measures of shocks and stresses, resilience capacities, coping strategies, and well-being outcomes.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think when Greg and I were originally getting started in all of this resilience measurement stuff, it was all over the board. People were using different approaches, but there was no common standard that was used. And so there was a technical working group that was created across multiple agencies and university staff to try to come up with more standard measures of at least the principles of measurement, and then also the analytical frameworks that we should be using for collecting this kind of data. And that's why we came down with really trying to get a good handle on the shocks and stresses that people are exposed to, the kinds of capacities that people rely on to manage those shocks and stresses. And that came out of work from DRR and adaptive capacity out of climate change work, as well as the transformative capacity related to more governance and trying to create the enabling conditions that enable governments and different societies to be able to manage these shocks and stresses. We also were very interested in different kinds of coping strategies and adaptive strategies that people use, because they combine these capacities in different ways. And then what effect were they having on the outcomes, the well-being outcomes? Food security was the one we were primarily focused on, but we branched out and we're looking at other well-being outcomes now across different sectors. So it's been an evolution. We've been trying very hard to have agreement on how we do these measures, but we realized that we needed to get some of these studies under our belt before we could start to simplify some of these data collection approaches. And we've been working very hard the last year or two to try to simplify what kinds of indicators we're using to measure these things. But we fortunately have been able to have enough commonality across multiple studies that allowed for this dashboard to be created. And so one of the advantages of this, as Greg has pointed out, is that we now have in one place a number of different studies that kind of are showing common trends with regards to which investments seem to be making the biggest difference, which resilience capacities are most important. How can we make sure that the kinds of interventions that we're promoting are going to actually create opportunities for communities and households and systems to be much more resilient to the shocks and stresses that they're exposed to. So I think this can be extremely valuable for trying to think through, okay, if I'm going to design a new program, what can I learn from this that will help me make the right choices with regards to where investment should be? And I think that this has great potential for helping us understand where the trends are and what are some of the key things that we should be thinking about when we're designing these programs. The other thing that I think is really important here is that we try to combine both quantitative and qualitative data collection here. Quantitative to make sure that we're capturing information on all these different indicators, but the qualitative gives us an in-depth perspective on what's going on in these communities and households and how their own perceptions of what's going on are really key to understanding what these indicators really mean. And so we have really stressed in all of our studies having a mixed method approach where we're both looking at quantitative and qualitative data collection. And that's why it's so important to continually emphasize that. Some of the studies we're doing more recently in Nigeria, we've found that the qualitative work that we're doing gives us much more insights on how people are affected by the conflict that's going on in the area. And the quantitative may not be picking up on that as easily. So these things are extremely important to make sure you capture both. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Including for that last part, I think first-time visitors to the dashboard will obviously note all the quantitative analysis that we brought together, but I really appreciate you stressing the importance of that mixed methods approach that Tango has used. And also our other partner, Mercy Corps, has carried out quite an extensive amount of qualitative research related to resilience capacities that we've integrated into the dashboard as well, and that you all can find in some of the technical briefs and other resources that we have on the REAL website. So both Tango and Mercy Corps have really invested in kind of synthesizing the analysis and learning that you see represented on the dashboard. Turning to that, I note that I think it's Emily or Karina. Emily just put in the link for our full list of resources that we've developed under REAL. And you'll see it's quite extensive. And it was quite a task for us to just begin to kind of make sense about how we could present some of these key takeaways. And we're very, very fortunate to have a partner in I4DI that has specific expertise in this area. So let me ask you, Micah, if you could give an overview of what type of data was included or excluded in the synthesis, and how did you go about helping us build this interactive platform?
Great. Thanks so much for that question. This was a really exciting opportunity for us at I4DI. It's not every day that we get to combine our deep research sector and technology expertise in such a meaningful, integrated manner, really coming together in an interactive dashboard to present this information. So we we used our inception period to really get our bearings to understand what's out there. We started by broadly gathering and mapping and assessing the information available to us. There was a lot of quantity, quality, and diversity of information. In the format in which that information was presented was really going to dictate how we could synthesize that information. The qualitative and quantitative data presented in reports needed to be processed differently from each other, and differently still from quantitative data presented in raw data sets. The mention that there was this mixed methodology really was important because we wanted to make sure that the data balance each other, that they were coming out telling a unique story, and that we really were balancing all that information effectively. Ultimately, we looked at dozens of data sources from 8 different USAID resilience programs from 2013 to 2020. As Emily had shown in the dashboard itself, you can see what those programs were and what all of that, what the reports that are supporting that was. The data sources varied quite a bit. They included periodic and final reports, so quarterly reports, annual reports, and whatnot, evaluation reports, baseline, endline, recurrent monitoring surveys. There were case studies, there were M&E data sets. So there was really a lot of different kinds of information presented in a variety of ways. And what we found was that there's a lot of variance in the information available to us for the synthesis exercise. Each program took somewhat distinct approaches to their reporting and presentation of information, and even collected different or similar information in slightly different ways. And so that made this synthesis exercise a little bit challenging to really orient and make sure we're finding those comparable and compatible data sets. Once we had a sense of the information available to us, we began to organize and analyze it. We initially separated it into the qualitative and quantitative information so that we could have similar types of information to look at. We focused on groups of data where we could find multiple data points across efforts, somewhat excluding individual data points because they didn't necessarily contribute to an overall synthesis and this broader understanding of results. The qualitative data were reviewed to identify common themes and patterns before further organizing them into additional sub-themes and so on. The quantitative data were grouped and coded for deeper analysis based on the data types and various metadata aspects. We used descriptive and inferential statistics to really understand the complex relationships among the data to make sure that we really explored how they all interacted with each other. And in the end, we looked at the data holistically to corroborate and triangulate the findings. We wanted to make sure that they were telling a compatible and cohesive story. With the data and findings in hand, we then began to explore the most appropriate data visuals. I4DI likes to let the data dictate the visuals as opposed to having something in mind and trying to squeeze the data into it. And for such an interactive, dynamic dashboard such as this, where we really wanted the users to be able to play with the data and interact with it and draw their own conclusions instead of presenting something specific. And so we made sure that the dashboard could be explored and ultimately get to the root source of the data, as Emily showed. So in any of the visuals, you can not only see the overarching findings, but really go double click into one level deeper and deeper still until you get to the source data. And I think that's what's really made this such a great success and so effective for users.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Micah, for that explanation. I know it's quite an endeavor that you launched off into. Really appreciate all of your expertise in this area. It's really helped us develop this resource together. So appreciate that explanation. I just want to note that we do have a couple more questions in the Google Doc sheet, and I will start with the $10,000 question. Tim, $10 million question, 10 billion maybe, that both you and Greg can weigh in on. It's from Mary Laurie asking if you can share, based on the analysis that we've compiled, which interventions and investments have had the greatest impact on resilience capacities and well-being outcomes. You're on mute.
That's a tough question. One of the things that we have noticed across our studies is opportunities where we're building social capital, where people are helping each other manage risk more effectively. That's been something that has across the board been a very important investment. So creating small groups, whether they be savings groups or environmental groups or water user groups, the kind of social capital that's generated through collaboration really makes a difference for these people to be able to manage other types of risks that they're exposed to. So that one is an important one. Another one is people's access to financial services. We've found that one has really made a difference with regards to diversifying livelihoods, enabling people to manage, moving into activities that are not as exposed to the same climate risks, so that they can actually diversify in a way that makes them less susceptible to some of those shocks. So that one's also been a very important one. I don't know, I'll turn it over to Greg. Greg, you have any other comments on this?
I would just reinforce what Christine said at the outset. I mean, the conclusion isn't which intervention works, it's which portfolio of investments across a range of sectoral interventions is needed to strengthen resilience. So it's everything from social capital and financial services to investments in agriculture and market systems. I highlighted shock responsive safety nets, but I think Christine and I both have a similar conclusion. It's really about a portfolio of investments. And as you all know, in the context of the way USAID is funded, you are given a whole series of earmarks that if they're not working in different countries, they typically run to different parts of the same country. So Christine and her team have an incredible endeavor that they work on every day, which is how do you bring systems thinking to an earmarked world? And how do you get these different parts of the agency to work together? And Christine probably sets Christine up to answer that next question about the resilience policy, because it is that co-created policy, the Resilience Leadership Council that Christine helps guide, that really bring these pieces of the puzzle together. And it's not just a challenge for USAID. Every time we work with a government, whether it was Kenya or Niger or Ethiopia or Malawi, getting them to be able to work cross-ministerially is a huge lift. And so we know it's challenging, but this evidence makes clear there's no other way to do it. There's no other way to effectively strengthen resilience.
Thank you very much, Greg. And lastly, I'll just add in response to Mary's question, I think, and following Micah's explanation of how all this learning was brought together, as he described, each of the impact evaluations, other resilience research studies were carried out with specific purposes and specific stakeholders in mind. And so it was quite a considerable task for I4DI to bring together kind of common areas of learning. But one area of the dashboard in which I think they've done that really well is in the key takeaway section at the end. And these are really trying to draw common lessons from across these multiple research efforts. And they do so in a concise way that speaks to some of what Tim and Greg have already mentioned: the importance of financial services, the importance of timely and shock responsive safety nets, the importance of taking a systems approach. So Mary, in response to your questions, those who might look at the dashboard and say, this is really hugely complex and rigorous and rich data, and where can I find a story for where it all comes together for non-resilience experts? I think that last section, key takeaways, does a great job of that. So let me turn now to ask another question that we've had, and maybe Emily, you can take. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just going to reiterate what Greg was saying. In our work, both in West Africa and in East Africa, what we have found is the comprehensive investments were comprehensive resilience programming where you have multiple sectors working together. Those are the ones that make the biggest difference in terms of impact. And so trying to layer these multiple interventions in with the same households and same communities makes a big difference in enabling them to manage these shocks and stresses more effectively. And as Greg rightly pointed out, a lot of governments aren't really interested in layering like that. They want you to spread out as thinly as possible so that they can reach more people in their country. But unfortunately, when you spread thinly like that, your impact goes down too. So I think that's one of the things we have to continually emphasize is we need to concentrate to actually capture the impact. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to try to field a couple of questions here. First, let me take one from Abi, and he's asking whether we looked into health. I'll say that primarily no, we have not done that intently thus far under REAL. Most of what we've done has been squarely focused on food and livelihood security and resilience to shocks, but health is obviously a critical well-being outcome for all of us, and it's an area that we're intending to dive deeper into under REAL 2. In the meantime, there's another question from Kevin about the temporal and spatial parameters of the resilience measurement for specific projects. So Emily, I'm wondering if you might screen share and just revisit that See the Metrics site where we can revisit Kevin's question, show the geographic areas for which we have data and the time series for which we have data. And then Tim, maybe you can explain how that took place in areas such as Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sahel.
Sure. Can you see the screen now?
We sure can.
Okay, so here, these maps show the spatial parameters, and then clicking see all indicators within any country shows the years from which the data was drawn. So you can view this information in the map and in the program sources of resilience evidence menu at the top. Under each program, it will list which data, quantitative data, is included in the dashboard.
Okay, thank you very much. Emily, another question, and perhaps this is best posed for you, Christine, and that is, how can the learning that we've captured here in the dashboard, how can it inform or how might it be reflected in the revised USAID resilience policy?
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for the great setup on this just moments ago. This evidence base, the investments we've made in resilience measurement over the last decade really are informing the new resilience policy. It will be out soon for external review and comment. And, we've got a wide set of implementing partners, donors, measurement practitioners on the line, and we very much welcome robust comments on it. I would note just two things. One, Tim also already mentioned the importance of social capital across. That is something that's very important. You will see that the policy really does reinforce and double down on our efforts to strengthen resilience in areas of recurrent crisis. But it also makes a pivot towards the broader application of these approaches and the learning that we've gained over the past decade. And a lot of this applies not just to our cross-sectoral work, but also the sector-specific work, thinking about empowerment, aspirations, social capital. These are all things that strengthen our sectoral investments as well and those outcomes. So you'll see that pivot as well, and it's very much based on the body of evidence, much of which that's presented in this dashboard. This has been a great tool for us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Christine. So I'm mindful of time, noting we've just got a few minutes left. I want to encourage everyone again, either to write questions or raise your hand. Feel free to come off mute and you can pose questions to speakers yourselves. In that line, I wanted to go back to you, Greg, and again, the intent is to make this tool as useful as possible to the widest range of users. We know that in trying to support evidence-based decision-making, we've got to note there are different types of decisions that are made each and every day by different types of stakeholders. So I wanted to get your perspective on what types of users you think might most benefit from the dashboard and how.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say in its most broadest sense, policy and investment decision makers. And that's everybody from Christine and the leadership at USAID to Congress, who's allocating resources, to partner country governments, and not just in capital cities, at a local level, at a county level in a place like Kenya. And of course, to all the implementing partners who make choices every day about how they design interventions, how they tweak interventions. And so, we probably this probably doesn't reach down to the ultimate decision maker, farmers, in terms of their access to this dashboard, but using this evidence and bringing it down to that level is also possible. And we co-convened a meeting to advance resilience measurement in May of this year, and really tried to dig into this question of user-driven, demand-driven resilience evidence and measurement. And it was a really rich discussion about, frankly, the huge array of evidence users. Like when we started this conversation, there was a very specific set of questions about areas of recurrent crisis in the Horn of Africa and then the Sahel. But as Christine said, the need to be thinking about resilience in these things now goes way beyond that. Everywhere we're working in international development. And if that wasn't already true, COVID made that clear. The Ukraine war made that even clearer, because all households are dealing with these complex risk environments that are impacting their well-being outcomes, whether it's health or food security or whatever. So I hope this is USAID generated dashboard based on USAID generated evidence, but my hope is that this gets out much more broadly, not just to USAID and its implementing partners, but that we have the opportunity to share it with partner country governments who are also, dealing with these crises in their countries and having to make tough decisions about where do we put our investment. So I would just encourage Christine and her team, the real partners, and all of us to really use this tool and get it out, share it widely. As I said at the beginning, it's really fun to play with. Like, carve out an afternoon and just start clicking around. You get kind of lost. I was actually late to a meeting when I first saw this because I kept clicking through, and then I was getting pinged on my phone, like, why aren't you in this meeting? It's that engaging. So all of us can be foot soldiers in getting this disseminated further. I mean, this is a great launch event, but I'd encourage all of us to really get this out. Let people know this exists, because it is such a rich resource.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Greg. We hope so. In the ways that you described, we hope that it will be useful for policy decision makers and those kind of formulating strategy. And we also hope that it will be useful for the ways that you mentioned, really for practitioners to get in there and learn a little bit more about some of the basic approaches to resilience measurement and some of the data that we have now in key shock-prone areas. So, again, this webinar was intended to just create greater awareness and certainly to promote this, hopefully, as a useful tool. But we realize that it's not it may be a perfect tool or not. There may be ways in which it could be improved. So wanted to use some time really to encourage some feedback from you all as practitioners. If you could come off mute, any brave souls to offer what you all see as the utility of this. How might it be improved? How might it be applied to complement your own resilience monitoring and learning strategies within your own institutions? Any volunteers to give initial feedback on what they view as the utility of this dashboard? In response to the question that is there about whether we intend to have it translated into other languages, we have not gotten there yet, but certainly we do have that facility and could do that. starting with French translation for our counterparts in the Sahel. Again, that question, thank you very much, about whether we intend to add data. We hope so. Again, there are a number of rich data sources out there that include resilience evidence. We've just got to find the way forward with our donors on how to add this. And again, it's a major task, as Micah was referring to make sure that it can be synthesized in a way that's consistent and complementary and meet certain standards. There is, I guess, an ongoing discussion about whether RFS will continue to invest in the same scale and the types of impact evaluations that generated much of this data. Those are very useful for certain purposes. And there's conversation about how we might adapt our own resilience data collection and analysis methodologies to provide more timely and more tailored analysis for specific stakeholders. So yes, there is an opportunity to continue to feed this dashboard.
So, hey, Tom, Dan Killian had his hand up, so.
Dan,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just a comment. I mean, I'm still digesting the dashboard, but I think it's fantastic. I want to thank you all for providing this service. I definitely intend to keep consulting it. And as I mentioned in a comment, you know, we recently had the opportunity to help the South Sudan mission with a resilience baseline in 21. And so if we can be of any service in adding the South Sudan evidence to the dashboard, by all means. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Any other comments or feedback? Karine, I see you offered a comment. I'll pick on you. I think just because you've got specific insight from the knowledge, research, and learning that's been generated over REAL, but also given your current position with BHA, you know, we do hope that this will be informative for much of the BRFS investments, but also we understand that BHA does a tremendous amount of resilience programming and generates a lot of resilience evidence as well. So could you speak to how BHA might utilize this resource?
Here I am. Yeah, I'm discovering it. So I like to play around it as well, and also encourage my other colleagues from BHA, which I don't know many are on the call right now, to really explore it and provide feedback to REAL and to the team on how we can use the dashboard and certainly contribute to it with more data from the different investments, in particular the RIFSAs that are implemented in the resilience-focused countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And Alyssa, I see your question as well, which was a very relevant one in terms of how this resource might best be used for adaptive management. So going forward, we've addressed the question that we certainly hope to be able to add more data. There's more research and learning being generated all the time, including through recurrent monitoring surveys that are ongoing in the Horn and in the Sahel. But let me turn that question to you, Greg, and then Tim. How do you feel that this resource might best support adaptive management of resilience programs?
You want to start, Tim?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think in the immediate term, you know, people who are implementing programs can dive into it and see, what can I take away from this? You know, some of the things Christine highlighted around social capital. That's not a sectoral intervention, but as Christine noted, and I'm really excited to see the policy now, Christine, every time we're working with communities, we have opportunities to either undermine social capital or enhance it in the way we approach the work that we're doing. The same in terms of strengthening people's agency and confidence to adapt. So thinking about what I often have referred to these transcendent sources of resilience, these psychosocial sources of resilience. Dan pointed to, engaging in civil societies. It's a form of social capital. So are we, through our sectoral interventions, taking every opportunity to really build into the programming approaches that strengthen these psychosocial sources of resilience? Because that's one thing that has come out so clear in the evidence base. And, initially when we started finding evidence that social capital mattered, the ability to lean on other households, people were like, well, what do I do with that? It's not a technical intervention. Well, this isn't a simple technical problem requiring a technical fix. It's a complex social problem that requires thinking across and beyond sectors. So I think every single person on this video call, everyone that interacts with the dashboard, can take away some of those insights. I think also thinking about not just single sector interventions, but how do interventions fit with the broader development enterprise going on in all the places we work. We often act as though this project's being implemented in isolation, but it's never actually true. There's all sorts of investments being made. And how do you bring this together in a cohesive way for that collective action piece? So those are just some initial thoughts. But yes, absolutely being able to see all this evidence in one place. I love the key takeaways. I think Christine, when we were preparing for this event, really called that out, like get that up front, because there's a lot of geeks like me who can dive into the database and have an afternoon or plus worth of fun. But what is the takeaway? What do you walk away with? And I think all of us can walk away with those insights around these transcendent sources of resilience. Tim?
No, I totally agree with that, Greg. And, one of the things that we've been doing in more recent data that we've been collecting in Kenya, for example, even though the shock environment has gotten worse and worse there, one of the things that the resilience investments have been doing there is they have definitely showed that those households that are participating in the resilience investments, their confidence to adapt to those shocks is much higher than in those places where that is not there. So we are finding that this holds true, even though the shock environments have gotten a lot worse. And I think that that's great to know. And I actually have, to be honest with you, even though I've been part of all of these studies, I haven't had a chance to really kind of interact with this tool as much as I wanted to actually look for some of these trends. So I think there's great opportunity here to learn more from our own work just by exploring this dashboard a little bit more. So, sometimes when you're in the weeds, you don't realize what the forest looks like. So this is very helpful, and I appreciate the work that they've done.
Thank you very much, Tim. I agree with you. I think I could spend much more time in there. There's so much to learn. And just to note that we're now out of time and we haven't had a chance to address some of the excellent questions you've all posed, but those questions are answerable through much of the information that you can find through the dashboard, including how we define things like social capital, including how we analyze social and ecological resilience in response to these recurrent climatic shocks. It's an area that we certainly want to improve on, but we've made efforts there, and you can find some of that learning in the detailed research documents. So let me just close by thanking each and every one of you for your time today. We hope this will be a useful resource. We hope you share it with your colleagues. We definitely ask you to take just a few minutes to fill out a survey from today's session to give us feedback, not only on the session, but on the dashboard itself. And then finally, I'll close by thanking each of our panelists. We really appreciate your time and your sharing your insights with us today. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Tom and team.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.